Okay, so it's time to take a look at our routes that we've defined for signing up, logging in, and logging out. So if we take a peek here at our routes directory, we see we have a new file called login.js, and let's see how we're using that first in our index file. So the same way we brought in our error handlers, we're bringing in our login routes by requiring them. And then we are passing our Express app into that login function. Let's take a look at the login function now. Okay, here's our login file. This is the new one, which contains all of the nitty-gritty to implement logging in and logging out. First thing we need to do is grab our Mongoose module and a reference to the user module, which has already been defined. We brought in three different helpers here, or two different helpers that we will be using a little bit below here within our logic while we're validating the data that's coming in and producing a hash. And we'll also need the crypto module to assist with hash creation later. The exports again are a single function that receives our Express app, and then we're going to wire up our routes the same way we did our other ones. In this case, we are setting our signup link route to this function that will just render our signup.jade file, which we already looked at. And now with a post to our signup URL, things get a little more interesting. So let's scroll down a little bit and take a peek at what's involved for creating a new account. On line 16, the first thing we do is grab the email parameter from the form. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, within our middleware, we set up the Express body parser. That stores the data internally on the request object that is exposed through the param method. So we can give the param method the name of the field we defined in our view, and request.param will give us the value back. So we're taking that value and we're going to pass it into our clean string method. Now this is a custom little method that accepts anything, and if it is not a string, sets it to a string, and then returns the string trimmed, so there's no white space in the beginning or the end. We do that for both our email and password input values. This is just a real simple way to validate that what's coming in is something that we can work with. So on line 18, if we don't have both an email and a password that have length, then we are going to just return and say, sorry, we can't work with this. This is an invalid data. So let's take a peek at what invalid does. It's a pretty simple function. Here's invalid. So all it does is response.render, the same template again, signup.jade, and it sets invalid to true. Now if you remember what we did in our view, we were checking if invalid was set, and if so, we were displaying a specific error message. So that's all that we're doing there. Now, assuming that the data is okay, we can move on now to line 22. And here, we are using our user model that we defined earlier. All of the models in Mongoose have a number of different helper methods. One of the helper methods is find by ID. Essentially, this is the same thing as find1, passing an object with an underscore ID property set to the value we passed. But this is a little shortcut that's pretty handy. Remember also, Mongoose cares about our schemas. So when you pass a value here, in our case email, Mongoose looks at the schema and says the query must be passed as a string because the schema says that this is a string. So even if we passed a number for email, Mongoose would take that number, cast it as a string, and run the query with the value as a string. So we get a proper match within MongoDB. Okay, so find by ID will execute the callback once it has a result, passing the error if there was one, and the user if there was one found. So if there is an error, we just pass that error to the next function, which is the third parameter in Express. And that passes flow control on to the next possible error handler. In our case, we already set up our error handler, so the error will end up there, it'll get logged, and the user will see a friendly error message. If there wasn't an error, we have to check to see if the user was found, because just because we're submitting a query doesn't mean a matching document will be located. So if there is a user found, we know that we can't sign up more than one account with the same email address. So we re-render our signup.jade file, and we just pass exists true, which is a flag that we have logic for in the view, if you recall, that prints a message, hey, that user already exists, maybe you're trying to log in. Otherwise, if the user doesn't exist, we need to create one. And the first thing we need to do is generate some random bytes that we're going to use for our hash. So the crypto module is a built-in module in Node.js, and it has a random bytes method. Feel free to look this stuff up on nodejs.org and read all about what this guy does, but it's just giving us random bytes. It does what it says it does. And if there's an error, this is an async operation. You never know what could happen. We'll handle the error by, again, passing the error onto the next function, which Express will then handle properly. Okay, line 32, we're going to create our plain JavaScript object here that's going to become our user document. And we define our underscore ID as the email. We set the user.salt property to the random bytes that we generated. We convert them first to a string. And then we take the salt and the password and we hash them together and set them as the user.hash. Now, if you're curious about what the hash function is doing, we can take a quick look at that. Let's look at our helpers, hash. So, we are again using the crypto module. This is just a simple function that accepts a password and a salt. It creates a hash with SHA-512, updates the hash with both the password and the salt, and then digests them and returns it as base 64. Pretty straightforward. So we've got our user with the ID, salt, and hash all ready to go. And we use the user models create method to create a user. And we pass an object. Under the covers, Mongoose is taking that object and creating a new document instance of our user model. So all of the properties that we pass to this create method will be cast based on what we've defined in our schema. So we are guaranteeing that our properties are set to their proper types before we save them. Not only do types get cast properly, but we also are executing all of the validation rules that were defined in the schema. In our case, we put a validation rule in for the ID. We wanted to validate that it is indeed an email address or something that looks like an email address. Otherwise, we're going to return with an error. So if any of these validation rules fail, we will pass the error back here in first position, the way any callback in Node receives an error in the first position. Otherwise, if there was no error, we'll have a new user object here returned to us. So, line 37, we're going to check for an error. And if that error is a validation error, that's what we're checking for here, we'll just return invalid. And that's pretty much the same as we saw before. We re-render the template setting a specific property that says, sorry, something was not cool. For now, this is all we're going to do. If you want to inspect the error message and see which properties were the ones that failed, you can go down that rabbit hole as far as you want and provide your users with more custom error messaging. Today, we're not going to do that. Otherwise, if it's not an instance of a Mongoose validation error, we want to pass that error along so that it ends up with our error handler again that we've defined in Express. Otherwise, we created the user successfully. And so what we need to do is set up our session to reflect that. We're going to automatically log them in, save the email as the user property in our session, and then we're just logging a little message to our console so we can see that, while we're developing if we're curious. And then we'll redirect the user back to the home page. Alright, so that's signing up. Let's take a look at this in action. So we'll start up our app and take a peek. Okay, we've got our server running on localhost 3000 again. And what we can do here is check out our couple new links here. We can either log in or create an account. And then down here is a list of our blog posts, and since we don't have any yet, it doesn't show anything. So let's create an account. Alright, so now we're on the sign up page, and we need to enter our email and password. So first, let's enter something that we can assume is an invalid email address, which is that, and then test password, and then we'll click sign up, and we should see an error message. Please enter a valid email address and password. Another thing we would do in real life here is not use this type of input. We would use a password input that would hide the password that you're entering, but for now this is okay just so that you guys can see what we're typing. So let's use something that we know isn't used. Okay, so at first glance, maybe this looks like it didn't work, but in fact it did. All we've done in our route here is we have put some logic in to change these links when you're logged in. So instead of seeing logged in and create account, we've changed that when we're logged in, we see the log out account. So that's how we know that the sign up worked and we actually logged in. So let's log out. Alright, and the other thing we need to look at now is the whole login process. So if I click log in, I pretty much have the same interface as I did before. We need to enter the email and the user's password. Try that out, and it works. Now that that works, let's take a look real quick at our log here. As you can see, when we created the user, we do have a line in our console saying which user we used to sign up, as well as all of the other URLs that we're hitting. So let's stop our server, take a look at our routes, and we want to look at the login and logout route, because we haven't looked at those yet. So login is very simple. Whenever login comes in, we're just going to render our view. And when a post is submitted to the login route, we need to validate that input. This is the exact same rules that we used when the user was being created. And so let's assume that the input is valid. What we need to do is then look up the user using the find by ID method again. We pass that email address, and if there was no user found, then we know that they entered something invalid. We don't want to tell them too much information. We just want them to know that either the user's email address or the password was entered incorrectly. So we just return by re-rendering that view and displaying an error message. And here we'll check the password using the same hash function and the user's salt that we had stored earlier mixed with the password that the user just submitted. And if that doesn't match the hash that we stored, we also know that's invalid, so we'll just display that default error message again. And then finally, we know that they are logged in. So we set is logged in to true, store the email in the session, and redirect them back home. And that's it. That's some basic login, logout functionality, user creation functionality for our blog. There are tools out there that exist already in NPM, designed specifically for Mongoose. Feel free to search for these guys. A good place to search for plugins for Mongoose is using the plugins.mongoosejs.com site. Maybe we could do auth search, see what happens, and there are some results. Identity store, bunch of other stuff. So yeah, a whole bunch of different results here. So feel free to dig around and search plugins.mongoosejs.com if you don't want to wire all this stuff up yourself.